Hi, I'm Pamela Bailey, and welcome to my YouTube channel, The Longer I Live, Lessons in Life, Love, and Family Reunifications. This first episode, I get to sit down with a father and a daughter who find each other after 47 years of being apart. If you like the episode, please give it a thumbs up. Feel free to share it. Thank you so much for watching. So I am so excited. I've got two really special guests with me today, Kesha Campbell and her father, who she calls my dad, Archie Booker. And this story is a very special one. And I wanted to do this interview so much because I know that this story is a special one and it's going to resonate for a lot of people. So I want to introduce to you Kesha Campbell and Archie Booker.
How you doing?
All right. So I want to talk a little bit about your story because I've known you, Kesha. I'm sorry, Lakeisha. I'm going to call you Kesha for this interview because that's how I know you. I do want to be completely transparent with my audience. You are my sister-in-love, sister-in-law technically, but I call you my sister-in-love. You've been a part of my family for over 20 years. And while I've known you and have loved you for so long, there's a huge part of your life that I didn't know about. And so you have done something really amazing within the last couple of years that for you has been both life-changing and life-affirming. And I want to talk about that today. And also, I want to talk about your relationship with your dad, who you have just reunited with less than a year ago. So tell me a little bit about growing up in South Carolina, being raised primarily initially by your grandmother.
So I was born in New York, 1975, born in New York. And then I lived in New York for a short time, maybe a couple years, 2, 3 years. And then I moved to Mullen, South Carolina, where I was raised by my grandmother and my grandfather. My mother was still in New York. And so I was there for I grew up there the rest of my life. So I was there for the rest of my life. But yeah, that is where I grew up, in Mullen, South Carolina.
So you said something that you started your life in New York, and that's going to be really important later on in the story. But do you remember about how old you were when you moved from New York to South Carolina?
I remember going to like a daycare in New York. So but I've always done school in South Carolina. So from first grade through 12th grade, I was in South Carolina. So I'm assuming I was probably around maybe 4 or 5 when I went to South Carolina.
And so you grew up being raised initially primarily by your grandmother. Like it was a very common thing for whatever reason during a period of time that there were a lot of kids in our community whose parents lived and worked in New York and they were being raised by grandparents. So your situation was not uncommon. Like it wasn't something that you didn't see with other family members and other kids in your school. And so when were you able to reunite with your mother on a more full-time basis? At what age?
Well, my mother was still, because she was still in New York working, like, I mean, I knew where she was and what she was doing. But again, I was there in South Carolina with my grandmother. So I would see my mother regularly. She would come visit South Carolina and, visit us. I can't remember exactly when she moved back to Mullins. Because when she initially moved back to Mullins, I kind of stayed with my grandmother still, because but we lived in close proximity. So it was my grandmother's house, my aunt's house was next door, and then my mom had a little house right across the street. So she was there. I can't remember exactly when she moved back to Mullins, but I think I was probably maybe around 13 years old when we moved together, like in a home together. Yeah.
Okay. Now, most of your formative years, you were aware or you believed that someone else was actually your father. But in your story, what I've learned so far over the last year or so is that you never actually lived in the home with your father. Did you know why that was?
Because he and my mother weren't together, like they never married, and so he lived in New York, and so he just wasn't. They weren't an item. They never married, so that's why I didn't
Mhm.
live in the house with him.
Did you ever spend any time with him, like in his home, around his family? I don't know if there were any other children.
Yeah. So no other children. He was an only child. And of course I'm an only child of my mother. So I spent very little time with him. We did not have a relationship really. It was very strained. However, his mother, whom I call my grandmother because that's who she is to me, she has passed away, but I spent a little bit more time with her. So I would go visit her in New York, New Jersey, later in Virginia. She moved to Virginia. So I would spend a little bit more time with her. I talked a little bit more to her than I did him. There were a few times, maybe a handful of times that I can remember
Mhm.
going to his home. So I have been to his home before, have gone, a few days here and there in the summer, but nothing substantial. No.
Okay. So I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit over to Mr. Archie. Archie, I know that you are from Virginia, that your family is from Virginia, but
That's
you met
correct.
Lakeisha's mother in New York. Tell me, how did you go from Virginia to New York? And I want to know a little bit about that initial meeting.
Well, going back to the beginning, growing up in a Pentecostal household, going to church every Sunday, all day long, and it just didn't sit well with me. So I said, as soon as I got out of here, I'm catching, as my aunt would say, the first thing smoking. And I did. I left. I went to visit an uncle in Brooklyn and never went back to Virginia. I worked a couple of jobs, menial jobs, got a job here. I ended up getting a assistant manager training position for FW Woolworth. And I would shift around from store to store. And I remember I was working at the Woolworth on 125th Street in Harlem. And I remember meeting Kesha's mother. One day we just looked at each other. She was shopping. Actually, she had a cousin who worked in the food service area in Woolworth. And we were pretty good friends. And she had come to visit her. And I was working, and we kind of connected. And then we ended up, her cousin, who I said worked in the food prep area, she was the manager, introduced us officially, and we kind of started going out. However, I had recently gotten out of a really, really toxic relationship, so I kind of wasn't looking for anything long term or substantial. And we went out for a short time, and that's how we officially met.
Okay, awesome. Archie, how old were you when you relocated back to New York or relocated to New York and when you met Keisha's mother?
When I came to New York, I was right out of high school. I wasn't interested in college. My older brother had gone to college. My oldest sister had gone to college. And I said, I'm out of here. I was probably 18, I believe.
And when you met her mother, that was about the age that you were?
No, I had worked around for a while. I think when we met, I was probably maybe 20.
About 20 years old. So I would imagine both of you very young then, very, very young. Okay, so I want to talk about back to you, Lakeisha. I want to talk about the fact that you knew who your father was, who you were told the name that this was your father, and for whatever reason, you didn't really have a great bond with him. And again, unfortunately, that wasn't uncommon. It wasn't one of those things that was so uncommon that it was strange specifically to you, but it was still an uncomfortable thing to you. So tell me, what was it like, sort of having to reckon with the fact that, you are, this kid and you know who your dad is, you have a relationship with his mother, but he doesn't seem to be that interested in having a relationship with you. Tell me a little bit about what that was like for you.
Hard. It was because I didn't know why. I couldn't figure out. I didn't understand why. So it was tough. Like whenever I would talk to him, there would be like promises made. You're coming here for the summer, or I'm going to do this, that, or the other, and things never happen. And again, as a child, you never know what conversations are being had with the adults in the situation. So I don't know all of those details, but I do know it was tough. I just remember by the time I got to college, when because he died when I was young, I was like 19 when he passed away. And so by the time I was able to, when I went away to college, I think I had come to a place where I was like at peace with whatever the relationship was. I just realized that it wasn't going to be what I wanted it to be. And I was at peace with that. I had to make peace with it to kind of move on. So,
Okay. And so while she's going through all of this, Archie, you are sort of reckoning with some things yourself because, when I learned this story after Kesha found you, I was surprised to learn that you knew of her existence and the possibility that she could be your child. Can you talk about that?
Okay, well, her, me and her mother were kind of in a semi-relationship for a while. We dated for some months, and I remember us having a conversation one day, and she said, I'm pregnant, and will you marry me? Point blank. And like I said, I just gotten out of a really, really toxic relationship. So I said, no, I'm not really ready to get married right now. Um, I'm not going to step into another long-term relationship right now. And I guess she took it as that's it, the end, forget about it. And I remember her cousin, who I think her name was Gate. We were pretty friendly because she worked in Woolworth and so did I. And she would always invite me to events and stuff. And I remember she was giving this party and she invited me. And I was going there and I was hoping to see her mother. And as I got there, I found that she was back with her old boyfriend again. And I kind of got, I guess, ego got involved. And I really got, I guess, hurt, for lack of a better word. And I stayed there for a couple of hours, maybe. And then finally, I kind of drifted out. And I said, well, you know what? Um, it is what it is. I remember going home and I sulked over it for, a while. But we never lost touch because I would always see her. And eventually I got transferred from Harlem to the Bronx where she lived. And she would always, I'd see her going by the store sometimes and she'd stop and she'd wave at me on her way past or she'd speak to me. And we kind of stayed kind of close, but we weren't an item. We were just friendly toward each other. We were on speaking terms, no bad blood. And eventually I found out when she gave birth, I I can't remember who told me. It may have been her. It may have been her cousin Gate. But I remember going to the hospital to see her the day of or the day after the birth. And I remember seeing this little precious little baby, and thinking, you know what? I could be her dad, It's very possible, you know, and it's kind of maybe likely that I am. So I remember calling my mother and telling her, you got a grandchild. And I remember my mother like cried because she would have been, well, she is the first grandchild in our family. And so we, over the next, I guess, time of her growing up, months, I would see her and I would actually go to visit her a couple of times. And her mother would give me pictures, but she never would tell me if I was her father or not. And I remember at one point in our relation, well, we didn't have whatever you call a relationship, but in our acquaintance, I asked her point blank, is she my child? And she refused to answer. She said, only God knows for sure, was her answer. And so I said, all right. So, but we stayed in touch, and she would allow me to come and get her from time to time and take her out. I can remember at least 3 to 4 separate occasions where, I was able to pick her up and take her out for the day. And, I remember we went on a boat one time, and I said, this should be interesting. And she was totally bored. And kind of so was I. And I said, this was not a good idea. So the next time I think I took her to the Central Park Zoo. Now, by this time, she was probably 2 years old, but I had been, in and out. I would always go to see her, but I never knew, you know. And at one point, her mother gave me a picture, like an 8 by 10 photograph of her. And I believe she was maybe 8, 9 months old. And I gave it to my mother, and my mother hung it on her living room wall. And that picture stayed there for like 4 to 5 years. And my mother and I never had another conversation. She never asked me, because I never brought her up because we weren't really an item, so to speak. So eventually, I ended up, well, I had gotten into another relationship during that time. And even though I was in another relationship, I would still come to see her. And, eventually, I kind of wanted to know because I needed some closure, and she would never, never, ever tell me. And so at one point, I ended up meeting the woman that would eventually become my wife, which I did marry. And I went to see her one day, and it was sort of like, you know what? I'm not, I can't do this. Either you tell me, and she told me no. The answer was no. And
Know that Kesha was not your daughter?
yes,
Okay.
absolutely. So
Okay.
I eventually lost touch, even though I always thought of this pretty little girl. But then I thought, how could this pretty little girl be my daughter? Myself kind of looking like a water hog, you know, and she was this pretty little girl. Um, so I got married and we moved on, but I remember coming back and looking for her, and she was gone. I saw Gate, and she goes, oh, she moved down back to Mullins, South Carolina. And so that kind of sealed it for me. And I never really, I kind of lost touch, and I just didn't pursue it. And we've had the conversation about, are you angry at me for not fighting for you? And I don't think she is, but, I kind of feel some guilt about it. You know, I should have stayed there and fought for you. But not believing at the time that, you know, I was her father, I kind of moved on.
Okay. And so it's interesting because one of the ways that Keisha was able to find you was through DNA. And of course, DNA is just a little bit older than she is. So, it was used, in court for a paternity test. But again, it was thousands of dollars. Like we can just buy a kit online now, sometimes on sale for $50. But it was thousands of dollars then. The technology and, how DNA worked was not widely known. And then you had, as I understand, the word of her mother saying that she was not your child. And again, no negative reflection on her because she was with a boyfriend, a previous boyfriend that she had been with prior to meeting you. Is that correct?
Yes,
So
that's
there was
correct.
some uncertainty there, but there was a chance that, you thought and believed that, she was your daughter. And then the other thing that I think is incredibly interesting is whether or not her mother thought that you were her father. She did see you as a good man because of the fact that you were able to have access to her, both in the home and to be able to take her with you. It speaks volumes about the level of the mother's trust towards you, but it was just this big looming question mark about whether she could be my child or not. But I want to go back to you, Keisha, because you had a very conscious memory. And what blows me away when you've talked with me about this memory is that this happened when you were 2 years old. And for a lot of us, our most conscious memories don't even start until we're at least 4 years old. And so, can you talk a little bit about this memory that kept coming back about you going to the zoo with a man?
So yeah, so I've always had a memory of going to the zoo with someone, and I can remember. Of course, I didn't know like how old I was, but I just remember being a young child going to the zoo. I just remember it being an incredibly just happy day. Um, we were at the zoo. This person was like taking pictures of me. Um, I could never in the memory, I can't see the person's face, but I do remember like a beard and just like hair. I just remember a beard and hair. But I couldn't really see a face. And the connection that I felt to the person was more like a godfather. I do remember the name. Uh, Now I know it's Booker, but I remember a Booker or a book or Bookman and I always laugh because we watched Good Times growing up, and so there was a guy on the show named Bookman. So it was all these references, but I didn't know exactly who the name was, and I definitely didn't know who the person was. But I just remember going to the zoo with this man who felt like a godfather to me. Again, I remember a beard, I remember hair, I remember a hat on his head, and I remember he had like a camera. And I also remember him picking me up, like taking me out of the apartment where we lived. And I sort of remember my arm like being around him and me waving goodbye to probably my mother or aunt or somebody who was, watching me leave. So I've had this vivid memory like all of my life, and that my kids know about it, my husband knows about it, and it's just something I never forgot. And yeah, I was 2.5 years old.
Talk to your mother about the memory and about this name that kept coming up.
I did. I would ask her, periodically during the course of my life, and she would always say, I don't know who that could be. It was your father, the guy who I thought was my father. It had to be your father who was taking you out. So that's kind of all I was told, but I never forgot it. And here's the thing, my memory is not the best, even now. Even as a younger person, my memory is like the best, but that memory is very vivid. And again, it's one I never forgot.
Okay. So you shared with me some time ago that before your father passed away, you wrote a letter,
Hmm.
and it was a very difficult letter.
Yeah.
And I want to talk a little bit about that, but I also want to talk about his response to you
Hmm.
and why that made you feel even more uncertain
Yeah.
about him being your dad.
So previously I talked about me sort of having to find closure with the guy who I thought was my father, because I realized the relationship that I wanted with him, it just wasn't going to happen.
Mhm.
And I think really God helped me to just find closure with it. And so in that, what I attempted to do was really just to write him a letter and say, listen, you know, no hard feelings. I'm good. I don't think we're ever gonna like have a relationship. But I just want to tell you like who I am as a person, because these are things he didn't know. He didn't really know who I was as a person, like what I was doing, my dreams, my goals, the things I wanted to do in life. So the letter to him was sort of my attempt to really just definitely find closure or get closure, because I'd already found closure, but also just to let him know I'm not mad, I'm not angry, and also this is who I am. This is who I am. So I sent him that letter, and he wrote me a letter back, and I still have it to this day. And he said some interesting things. But one thing he did say that really in this letter had to be, again, I was in college. So if he died when I was 19, then it had to be maybe I was 18, 19, somewhere in there. He wrote me back, and in the letter, and I don't want to quote it but it said something to the effect of, um, if you want to know the truth, talk to your mother. So in my mind back then, because I up until that point, I was sure that this other guy was my dad. Like, so when he said that, I initially thought he was talking about, if you want to know the truth, talk to your mother. I thought he was talking about, I tried to pursue a relationship with you, or I tried to do things with you, and she would
Mhm.
not allow. That's what I thought he was saying.
Mhm.
And maybe he was. Again, he passed away, so he and I never really had a conversation. So maybe that is what he was referencing. But I remember circling that and highlighting that, and I'm like, that it just was interesting, the wording. And again, that is not exactly how he said it, but it was something to that effect. But I know that like that phrase like stuck with me for a while. And um it was just interesting to me that he would say that and say it in that way. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, it was the choice of words was sounds very deliberate, intentional. And so let me ask, did you talk to your mother about it? Like exactly what did he mean by that?
I did not. No, I didn't, because I think I just assumed that he meant
Something
I tried to
else.
do more. And
Mhm.
I tried to see you, and it just, and I also don't remember exactly the time frame between when he wrote the letter and then when he passed away.
Mhm.
So it could have been that I felt like if he had passed away, then what's the point anyway?
Right.
So no, I never talked to her about that.
Okay, so this is what's interesting to me then. So if you felt, that you had closure with him, even prior to having written that letter to him, like this is how it's going to be, I have no control over that, this is what it is. So you had closure. And then certainly once he passed away and he couldn't give you any more answers or, excuses or,
Mhm.
represent, the situation in any other way, that truly was closure. So what made you decide to pursue anyway?
So again, like I mentioned, he was an only child, and I grew up an only child. And so when 2020 happened, everybody at the house, and I knew that you did a lot with ancestry. And so I have always, for the most part, I've always wanted siblings. Like I've always wanted like a sister or a brother. Now I grew up with cousins, so there were kids around. So I wasn't like by myself, but I always wanted brothers and sisters. And so when 2020 hit and we were, everybody was at home, I was like, you know what? I wonder if he had any children. Because again, I didn't he married twice. I know with one of his wives they didn't have children, but I didn't know anyway. I mean, he was a younger man. I mean, he could have had
Mhm.
kids. And I knew that people were getting, doing ancestry to find family and whatnot. So I said, I'm gonna buy this little kit and see what I could find. So I'm like, order the kit and go online, do all the things. The interesting thing is, though, what I did discover is I discovered his family. Now, I didn't have a relationship with him, and I knew almost nothing about his family other than my grandmother, his mother. So I didn't even grow up like knowing his family, like his aunts and uncles and his extended family. I knew nothing about those folks. And so when I got onto Ancestry, I discovered a young man who I still call him my cousin, but I discovered him on Ancestry, and he is a lot like you, where he spends a lot of time. This is what he does. He loves it. So the cool thing was when I went on Ancestry, I was able to discover all of that side of my family that I never knew. So, me and my cousin, we kept in contact, and he said, you should do, there's a DNA piece of this, there's a part where you can just kind of build out your family tree. He was like, but there's a DNA piece that you could, you spit in a tube and you send it back and they send you the information. I was like, okay. So I did that. And when I did that, and I got my results back, and I went into my profile to see who my family members were. Uh, he did not show up in my as a cousin to me, and so I
Mm.
was like, oh. So he was like, well, that can't be right. Let's try something else. Again, he's like an expert at this. He was like, well, maybe something's not right. So he looks at my at my profile and sees all my family. And he's like, I'm not in there. So then I call another cousin, and this lady was his first cousin, the guy who I thought was my father. It's his first cousin. She actually took great care of my grandmother after the guy who I thought was my father after he passed away. And so she's not even on any of this stuff. And so I call her, I'm like, listen, I did, the DNA test, and none of this family is showing as a part. They're not showing in my family tree in my profile. And so she said, well, that can't be right. So let me do it. And so she ended up doing it. So now we got two people doing these DNA tests. She does it, results come back, and she is not related to me either. Yeah. And so then
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, this is
So
out,
we're back to square one. We're back
Yeah.
to square one. Yeah.
Mhm.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, Mr. Archie, while all this is going on and, Keisha's sort of living her life down in South Carolina, and you mentioned you met someone who later became your wife. You all now have a son, who's your second child that we know now.
Yeah.
But had you pretty much just moved on with your life and just really didn't, and again, I don't want you to, when you answer this, I just want you to be as candid as possible because I don't want you to think about, her feeling like you didn't think about her, but did you pretty much move on with not really thinking about the fact that you had a daughter out here?
I kind of did, but I remember my wife having the conversation a couple of times, and we had the discussion that, I thought maybe I had a daughter out here. And she goes, well, you should have done a DNA test back then. But back then, DNA really wasn't that widely accepted and it wasn't cheap. But we kind of moved, I moved on kind of sort of in the sense that I always thought about this little girl. I would always think, yeah, I wonder whatever happened to her. I wonder how she's doing. I wonder, what kind of woman she turned out to be all through my life. And it used to irritate my wife sometimes, especially when the conversation came up. And her feelings were kind of like, you know, she's not your daughter. Why don't you just move on, let it go? And we had that conversation more than once,
Mm-hmm.
And not too, well, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I was talking to a friend of mine, and he was kind of relaying a story. And he was saying, you know what, I happened to come across, I found out I have a daughter. She lives in, believe it or not, Charlotte, North Carolina. And he lived in Maryland. But I met him in New York. We became friends. And he goes, I can't believe it. So what I did was we kind of connected, and we moved. We were remote from each other, but we decided we were going to meet halfway. And so he went south and she came north, and they met at a hotel. I don't remember exactly where it was exactly, but he like bonded with her, and they ended up having a DNA test done, and he found out he was indeed her father. And I said, oh man, that kind of gave me a little bit of hope. So it was at that point I really started thinking about her more. It was like, man, I wonder, maybe. Um, I even thought about, kind of became sort of an obsession. Now I'm not the smartest, the sharpest tool in the shed, but I wasn't aware that you could do stuff like DNA and ancestry and find people you were connected to. I was wondering, I was saying, what if I just take a ride one day back to Mullins, South Carolina, which I had never been. And I said, and just look for her. And I really thought about doing that. But then I said, how ridiculous does that sound? Some grown man showing up in this random town in South Carolina looking for this little girl that you lost. I said, that sounds pretty ridiculous to me. So I asked a friend of mine I even thought about hiring a private detective to look for her. So I was talking to a friend of mine one day, and he goes, don't you know about Facebook? And I said, yeah, but what's that got to do with anything? Because I'm not really a computer savvy person. And I had no idea, how to go about this. But it always, like, I would say the last 4 years, I thought about her constantly, like wondering whatever happened to her, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It did.
So you said some things that are very real, because I can imagine all the things that may have gone through your mind. Like, what if her mother remarried and never told her that there was somebody else who could possibly be her father, and the possibility of you just upsetting her whole world because you want to know who she is when she may not have any knowledge of who you are. So there were a lot of things to consider about just taking that drive down to Mullins, South Carolina to find your little girl who's now a woman.
Yes.
So, Kesha, can you tell me a little bit about what it was like after you took your DNA? And the test that you took is an autosomal DNA test. And it is used for a paternity test, even though people use it to do research, genealogy, find out about their ancestral families. It is that test that was invented for the purpose of people going to court to find out who a parent is for a child. So when you took that test, when you get your results, you are automatically, if you leave your results open, you start connecting to people. that you share DNA material with. And so you started getting these people that are, cousins to you, first cousins, second cousins, and this is not your family from South Carolina. And you now know this is not the family of the man that you thought was your dad. So tell me about your feelings when you started almost immediately becoming connected to people that you didn't know.
So the interesting thing is with Ancestry, what I have found with a lot of the people I connected with are people are using this, like you said, to find family. And so sometimes a lot of people that you call or connect with, they're like in the same boat as you. They're like, I don't know my family, so I can't really give you any substantial information. And so it kind of went back and forth like that. So this was 2020 when I got my results. And so I would sort of start on my own, kind of going through everybody that's I always say hitting me as a cousin, but they're showing up in my DNA as a cousin, not a first cousin, like typically the second, third, fourth cousins. So I'm just randomly, I have this like a template of a message that I just like cut and paste to everybody on there. I'm looking for my family. Can you reach out to me? And there were many people who reached out to me. But it just I could never really find out like who it was. And I kind of went that route for really like 4 years. So from 2020, and then there were times it's like when I was like, okay, well, maybe I'm just not gonna find, my dad, and that's okay. And then, you start thinking, well, if he's around the same age as your mother, like if he's around the same age as my mother, like, is he still living? And you start to kind of have all these questions. So I think for me, I kind of went back and forth for a while. Well, I would aggressively like look, and then I would be like, if nothing, came of it, then I would just kind of take a break, and then I would do it again for a little bit, because it's a lot. It's exhausting. It is. You're talking to all these random people who are their family by DNA, but they don't know me. I don't know them. Thank God, everybody, I will say almost everybody I talked to was really open to it. That's another great thing about Ancestry is typically people who are on there, they're really open to talking and having conversations because they're trying to find people as well. But I was never, ever, ever able to really make a solid connection. I did meet a cousin on my mother's side of the family, and he and I are incredibly close right now. His story is sort of similar. He was looking for his dad. We connected on Ancestry, and I, along with the help of my aunt on my mother's sister, we were able to help him find out who his father was. And his father was my maternal grandmother's half brother. And so he and I became incredibly close. Like we're still really close to this day. Um, and so he would tell me all the time. He had this lady that he worked with. Her name is Annette, and she kind of does this as a hobby. I mean, she does this as a hobby. She loves it. She's really good at it. And he would tell me over the course from 2020 up into 2024, she was like, you need to call Annette. Just call Annette and just see. I was like, I'm good. I think I could do this by myself. I could find it. So finally one day I'm like, okay, I'm spent. I don't know what else to do. I call Annette one day, let her know that, my cousin referred her, and she and I talked. She said, well, give me access to your family tree. So she was able to log on and see all the things that she needed to see. She and I talked maybe about 30 minutes. And literally within about 2.5 hours, within 2.5 hours, she called me back. And at that time, I was with my mother. I was traveling from my home to South Carolina because my mother was in the hospital. And so when she called me, she had like these last names. She's like, I need you to ask your mom, does she remember a Booker, Cheeks, Spinks,
And Golston.
and Golston? So I'm like, first of all, I'm like, how in the world did you do that in 2 hours? So anyway,
Right.
she gave me those names. So I'm with my mother, and I tell her those names. And so when I say Booker, she says, yeah, I was involved with someone named Booker. But you remember, this is like what, at this point it's 47, almost 50. I'm 50, so nearly 50 years ago. So I said, Annette Booker, let's go with Booker. So she takes Booker, and so still talking to my mom, trying to come up with like names of Booker. So Annette does her thing, whatever she does, and she comes back with names of Bookers. And so I'm telling my mom the names, and long story short, she says, I think his name was Archie. And so we kind of went from there. Annette, well, at first, when we confirmed that it was Archie Booker, so then I get on Facebook and I'm like, I'm looking for all the Archie Bookers. And so I started showing my mom pictures, because there were a couple of Archie Bookers on there. And then, I kind of started doing my thing of trying to connect, trying to do what I can't do, because Annette is an expert and I am not. So when we discovered it was Archie Booker, Annette, she said, well, do you want me to reach out to him? And at this point, I'm like, this could really be happening. And I'm starting to have all these thoughts about, like, what is this going to be like? Is he going to want to talk to me? Is he going to, all the things. So I said, Annette, okay, let me try to reach out. So my attempt to reach out was go to Messenger and just put, I think I just said,
hello, Mr. Booker.
Hello, Mr. Booker. That was me reaching out, right? So a few days go by, and I'm like, Annette, he's not responding, but that's all I said. That's the most random thing, right? So, no response. And she says, okay, let me try. And so I talked to my mom about Archie and how they met. And so I give Annette all the information that my mother's given me. He worked at Woolworth, and he was in New York and all the things. And I also sent Annette a picture of my mother as a younger woman. So I did all of that, and she reached out to my dad, and
The rest is history.
pretty much.